You know, watching the worship and watching this wall be put together during it reminds me that humans are really good at building walls, aren't we? We've become experts at building walls. In fact, it's part of what we do as humans. We've gotten really good at it to the point of we train our kids how to build walls. Tell me that's not true of you. How many of you grew up playing Game Boy like me? 80s, 90s kids? Yep. Game Boy, one of the best games on Game Boy, Tetris. Not a whole lot that went to it, but play Tetris, and what you're doing is you're building a wall, right? And if you're really good, you build walls without holes in them, and you get more points. You learn how to build walls from a young age. Maybe you're not a Game Boy person. Maybe you are a Lego person. Mom didn't let you play video games, so you had to build walls with Legos. Back in the day, for the kids in the room, that's what we built. We built walls. We didn't build Death Stars and the Roman Colosseum and race cars. We built walls, brick on top of brick on top of brick. See how big you can build that thing before it falls over? And if it didn't fall over, you kick the thing over and you bust it into pieces. Then mom and dad step on it and get mad at you and yell at you for the rest of the day. That's what happened. But for those of you who are younger, maybe this is how you build walls. Minecraft. Anybody played Minecraft growing up? What you do in Minecraft? You build a wall and then you use your pickaxe to tear that thing down. And then you build another wall and you tear it down. You can even buy walls you don't even have to build. We teach our kids how to build walls because we're expert wall builders. One of the proofs of that is that the 7 wonders of the world. What's one of the 7 wonders of the world? The Great Wall of China is just a big wall that we built. In fact, when aliens, I don't know if aliens are a thing, I doubt it, but if they're hovering over Earth, supposedly you can see our Great Wall from space. That's what they know about us. These people must build walls. Look at that thing. It's great. But it wasn't just China that built a wall. Another wall, which actually looks similar to this one, all painted, was a wall that split Berlin in half. For those of you who grew up in the 80s and 90s, you also know about the Berlin Wall. It was built up, it was resurrected, and then what happened? It came tumbling down. Gorbachev bring down that wall, and that wall was torn down. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I don't build walls. You build walls. Look around your house. What's around your house? Outside of your yard, you've got a privacy fence, or as I like to call it, a wall that separates you from those annoying people next to you. Unless you invited them to Easter and they're sitting with you right now, then I know they're really kind people. But we build walls, we like walls, and then we tear walls down. That's kind of the cycle of humanity. We build them up, we tear them down, we build them up, we tear them down. How many of you bought into the open concept of your house where your spouse made you tear down a wall because she wanted an open concept like Chip and JoJo? We got to be able to see everything. And then what happened? COVID strikes, and you're like, I'm sick of being near the kids, so build the walls back up. Put those things all the way back up. We build them up, we tear them down. That's the cycle of human history. Now, historically, these walls, they've come down a few different ways. They've come through social movements like the Berlin Wall. They come down in that way. Or a lot of walls throughout history come down because of earthquakes. You look at archaeological sites and all that's left is just walls in rubble. And there's one specific historical event that happened that brought down walls that I want to talk about this morning. And it's the historical event that happened 2,000 years ago that we're here to celebrate. A man from Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem, nailed to a cross, died, put into a tomb. The earth shook and walls came down. What I want to talk about today is the resurrection and how the resurrection shakes the walls that shut us in, shut us out, and shut us down. As I was reading through the gospel story a few months ago, I became aware of all these barriers that Jesus had to walk through during the Easter week. And sometimes literally walk through these barriers, and they show up time and time again, but I miss them. But what I realized was, man, Jesus spent Easter week bringing down walls. That something historical was happening that was shaking the world around him. And he begins to interact with these barriers that are trying to keep him from accomplishing his mission, which was the resurrection on Sunday. But no wall was able to do it. So what I want to do today is just look at 4 walls that were shaken and fell during the Easter story. These are the 4 walls that fall. The first one is the wall of perfection. Walls of perfection fall down during the Easter story. Now, here's the mindset that we have of God. A lot of us have this picture of God, that God is perfect, and it's a right picture, that God is holy, he's pure, he's blameless. That is a right, accurate picture of God. But then we have this little tweaked view of God, that if God is perfect, then he must prefer perfect people. Maybe we wouldn't vocalize that, but we sure believe it. That God is perfect, God is holy, and so he prefers to be around perfect, holy people. He prefers to be around things and people that are like him. And so since we're not like him, then what he does is he separates us and he pushes us away. Now, what we know about ourselves is we are not perfect. And so if God prefers perfect people, then he must not prefer me. Because I'm not perfect. I'm frankly dysfunctional. Some of you are like, I'm dysfunctional. I'm also in a dysfunctional family. And you're getting ready to go to Easter lunch probably, and you're going to experience a lot of that dysfunction here in a few minutes. You're going to realize that you are not perfect. Your family's not perfect. And then you take a little bit deeper look at your own self, and you begin to realize, man, I'm far from perfect. In fact, I'm wounded. There's some stuff that's happened in my life to me, and sometimes through me, that I'm ashamed of. And if God is perfect and I'm imperfect, then who am I to be welcomed by a perfect God? Essentially what that is, it's a wall of perfection that we've built up. We've built this wall and we've said, God, you're on that side of the wall and I'm on this side of the wall. Perfection's on that side of the wall, and since I'm not perfect, I can't be near you. I have to be separated from you. Can I tell you, on Easter, this was the very first wall to come tumbling down, the walls of perfection. We read about it in Mark chapter 15. In Mark 15, starting with verse 37, we get this picture of Jesus. It's Friday. Jesus has been captured. He's been nailed to the cross, and now he is hanging in front of all the world to see. And he's getting ready to take his last breath. But what I want you to see is what happens after his last breath. This is what Mark writes in Mark 15, verse 37 and 38. It says, Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, I think it's interesting how Mark writes this. He talks about, on one hand, Jesus dying and taking his last breath, and he's dead. And the very next sentence, the thing that he points out, is something that's happening down the street, away from the cross, in the temple. Something happens whenever Jesus dies that impacts walls around us. And he says, in the temple veil was torn from top to bottom into two. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the temple was, in the Jewish mindset, the place where God interacted with humanity. That was the holy place where God came down to Israel, came to Jerusalem, and he interacted with people. But because all people, yourselves included, are imperfect, unholy, you were not allowed into the room where Jesus interacted. That room was called the Holy of Holies. The only people that could enter that room were the holiest of holy people, and there was none on earth. They made an exception one time a year. They let a religious leader go in there and have a conversation, a prayer time with God, and then he was to leave immediately. There was this, at the front door of the Holy of Holies, there was this curtain. It wasn't a door, it was a huge curtain. In fact, it was 30 feet tall by 30 feet wide. That is a big curtain. This isn't a curtain like that's hanging over your shower, okay? This isn't your living room curtain. This is a massive curtain. It serves more as a wall in all reality. And what that served as was this barrier between God and his holiness and his perfection and all of us in our imperfection. In Mark chapter 15, we hear that Jesus breathes his last, and that curtain was torn from top to bottom. And that's the author's way of telling us that it is not us who brings down this wall, but it is God on high who himself removes the wall. God is the one who takes down this wall of perfection. And essentially what we're being told is that in this moment, whenever Jesus breathes his last, the walls of perfection come down, which means you have access to God, whether you're holy or not, whether you're perfect or not. You no longer have to be separated from God. Now, this is important to hear on Easter because I realize that some of you are sitting in a church for your very first time in a long time. You thought you were going to be struck by lightning when you entered the room. You made that joke to your friend who invited you. I don't know, I'm not perfect, I've sinned, and I'll be struck by God if I step into that room. And the reality is many of us, we view God as separate still. Is that he's perfect and I'm not, so I've got to stay separate. So what we do is we stop being a part of a church community, or I'm imperfect and I see my dysfunction, so I stop praying because I must not have access to the relationship with God that other people have. And a lot of us, we build up that wall of perfection. But can I tell you something? The wall of perfection was torn in two, which means we all have access to a perfect God, whether you're perfect or not. I know you're looking around and you're like, man, these people, they look good today, dressed in their Easter best, a smile's on their face. But can I tell you, I know these people. They may be dressed in their Easter best, but they're an Easter mess. I've heard their stories. I know what they're struggling with. They're a sinner. I'm a sinner. You're a sinner. We've all messed up. None of us are perfect. Yet on Easter, the story of Easter is that wall of perfection comes down, which gives all of us the ability to access a perfect God. There was a second wall that came down on Easter. And it's a different one, but one that many of us are facing right now. It's a wall of anxiety comes down on Easter. Walls of anxiety come down. Anxiety is a really big deal right now in our culture for some reason. I don't know why the rates of anxiety are rising. I saw a stat recently that said that 20% of adults struggle with some form of anxiety right now. That there's this weight on them. When they look at the world and look what's happening around them, it's just this weight that they just can't get off of them. And then you look at adolescence and it gets worse. 32% of adolescents are struggling with anxiety. I know many of you in the room, that's what you're feeling now. There's this anxiousness or there's this thing that's just weighing on you. The question I would have for those of us who feel that weight is, what do we do when we feel that weight? When it feels like we're being pressed down, what's our natural response? Maybe you're like me. My natural response is to build up walls. That's what I will naturally do. I want to build up a wall to protect myself from whatever's happening out there in the world. There's a lot of dangers, there's a lot of fears, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and it weighs on me. So what I do is I begin to build up walls. Some of you are sitting here right now, and you've got the same walls of anxiety up. And the way that we build those sometimes is we literally sometimes lock ourselves within walls. We stay in our house. We can't go outside. We refuse to go into spaces like this, or we lock ourselves into our room. Sometimes we lock ourselves away from people. We stop answering phone calls and texts from family and friends who care about us. And yeah, we'll jump into spaces like this on occasion, but we got to make sure we hide it all behind the smile and behind the clothes, when in reality, what's happening behind the smile is just the mind is racing. That there's something coming up on Monday at work. There's something that's coming from the doctors that I don't want to hear. There's something happening in the family that I can't believe is happening in our family. So we build these walls that we think will protect us. But in reality, what they're doing is they're imprisoning us. These walls push in closer, and we build more and more walls, and instead of protecting us from people, they isolate us from people. Instead of keeping dangers out, they trap us inside. And that's what some of you are feeling right now. Well, can I tell you, if that's you, you're in good company when it comes to the disciples. On Easter weekend, when you read the story of Jesus, after Jesus dies, fear and anxiety set in for his closest friends. The disciples, they've just watched their Savior die on the cross. This is the man who was supposed to save the world, and now he's just died at the hands of the world. For them, they lost a lot on that Friday whenever Jesus died. They lost their Savior, but then they gave up a lot to follow this man. They gave up their careers. When Jesus died, their future was gone. They gave up fishing, they gave up their careers to follow this man, to be a student of him, and now he's gone, he's dead. Now what are they? They have no clue what they are. They've lost their futures. A lot of them left their hometowns. A lot of them left their family behind to follow Jesus, and now they're far from home in the middle of a big city of Jerusalem. No career, no family, no home. All they have is fear. You know what they do with that fear and that anxiety that's pressing in on them? They build a wall. They go into this room and they lock a door. In John chapter 20, this is what it says happens. That Sunday evening after Jesus had died, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. They just knew that whatever was happening out there is getting ready to happen in here. And they were afraid for their lives, so they put up walls and they locked the doors. But then it says this, suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. I love these few verses here because there's two miracles that happen that we easily read over when we're reading the story. Number one is it says, suddenly Jesus appeared. The door was locked, friends. They were locked in that room. They were behind these walls that they thought were impenetrable, meant to keep everybody out. And all of a sudden, suddenly, Jesus appears. You know what that means? He walked through a wall. But that wasn't the most powerful miracle that happens in my mind. The second miracle is maybe more powerful. Because it wasn't just Jesus that walked through that wall, but Jesus standing there among them says, peace be with you. Second miracle is that there was peace in the middle of that room. As they're huddled away behind locked doors, afraid and anxious and fearful, Jesus appears, but he doesn't appear alone. He brings peace in the middle of anxiety. How many of you would like to experience that miracle? In the midst of your anxiousness, in the midst of your fear, Jesus shows up with peace. And you know, when Jesus showed up, the disciples were assured of something. They were assured that even when the world is unfair, even when things seem unjust, even when the world seems unforgiving, Jesus is not. All of a sudden, Jesus is here, and he brings peace with him. And even though he was just murdered, he seems to be at peace, and he seems to be in control still. And when the disciples realized that, their walls of fear and anxiety just come down. Because here's what they know. If death can't stop Jesus, then whatever I'm afraid of can't stop him either. And that's good news. But in order for that to be good news, you've got to let him in. And then when Jesus enters the room, when he suddenly appears, when he brings peace with him, here's what happens. The walls of anxiety come tumbling down as well. Now, I notice some of you doubt that. Because anxiety and fear has been just part of your life. It's been part of your day-to-day struggle. You're like, there's no way that could happen. I've prayed that this would go away. I've talked to people, and I still have this inside of me. Some of you are sitting here and not just doubting that, but you're doubting the fact that Jesus would just show up. You're like, dead people don't rise. There's life, there's death, and that's the end. It's just unbelievable that people would gather together to celebrate that somebody rose from the dead. You've got this wall that's up, and it's the third wall that Jesus deals with. It's the wall of doubt. And can I tell you, if you're sitting here in doubt today, you're also in good company. You're not the only one in this room who's struggling with that. You're not the only one in this story who is struggling with that. What we read is that when Jesus appeared to those disciples in that locked room, there was one disciple that was missing. His name was Thomas. This is his story. In John chapter 20, it says, one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, who was nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." Do you get the sense that the rest of these disciples, They're not holding on to that anxiousness anymore. There's this freedom that they sense because they've seen the Lord. Thomas comes back from whatever he was doing, and they're like, Thomas, we've seen him. We don't need to lock the doors anymore. Jesus is alive. Thomas replies, I won't believe it unless I see it. I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands and put my fingers in them. I won't believe it until I place my hand into the wound in his side. Essentially what Thomas is struggling with is walls in this moment. The rest of the disciples, their walls of fear came down. Thomas's didn't. And then he hears that Jesus rises from the dead and another wall comes up. It's a wall of doubt. It's like, I'm not gonna believe in your fairy tales. Dead people don't rise from the dead. The only way I would believe it is if I see it. You know what? That's not even enough. I need to be able to touch it with my own hands. I need to touch Jesus alive, own hands, and feel the holes in his hands. Feel the mark in his side. Well, the story continues. 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with him. I guarantee you, Thomas didn't leave that room again. The doors were locked. My imagination says that Thomas is probably the one that locked it. But suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he turns to Thomas and looks at Thomas and says this. Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand here in the wounds of my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. In that moment, Thomas's walls of fear and anxiety, Thomas's wall of doubts come tumbling down. And his response is not to reach out and touch Jesus. He'd done all this negotiation, but Jesus showing up, bringing peace was enough. And so his response was, my Lord and my God. What I love about this passage is that Jesus comes back for Thomas. And some of us think, I've been left behind by Jesus. I've got all these doubts. All these people seem to believe really easily. They have this heart of faith, but that's not me. I've got all these doubts. But what Jesus does is he goes to the people who have faith and fear, but he also goes to the people who have doubt and fear. And what he does for Thomas is what he does for all of us as well, is that he comes back for us. What Jesus does is he comes back for Thomas, which means he doesn't abandon Thomas. He doesn't chastise Thomas because Thomas has doubts. He doesn't appear suddenly in the room and say, Thomas, how could you doubt? Where is your faith? He's not mad that Thomas desires to have proof that Jesus rose from the dead. What does Jesus do? He shows up in the midst of Thomas's doubts. And he makes eye contact with him. He says, Thomas, here I am. You wanted proof? I'm glad you asked for it. Here's my hand, touch it. Here's my side, feel it. Thomas, you don't have to be faithless. You can believe. I realize how unbelievable it is that a man rose from the dead. Thomas didn't believe it. The disciples didn't believe it when the women told them. The Jewish people of the day didn't believe it. The Romans didn't believe it. Many people today don't believe it. It is unbelievable. And it is okay to tell Jesus that. It is okay to express that doubt. The doubts you have, Jesus is not afraid of you voicing them. In fact, when you voice them, here's what happens. Jesus steps into them. Ask your questions. Ask them to Jesus and see if he won't start to answer and plant little seeds of faith that draw you into him. Because that's what I've experienced for my own life. Whenever I express a doubt to Jesus, and then what begins to happen is, I'm like, Jesus, this wall, it just seems too big to overcome and to step over to me. But then I begin to realize that even that doubt is kind of shaky. Can I ask you to do this? I know you doubt Jesus, but I also know you doubt your doubts. There's moments where you're sitting there and you're wondering, maybe, I don't know. But maybe that's too good to be true, though. It's okay to voice those doubts. When you do, here's what I believe. Jesus steps in and he begins to tear down the walls. And when the walls start coming down, let them go. Doubt your doubts and watch Jesus bring down that wall. There's a fourth wall that comes down during the Easter story, and it's the most obvious one. It's the wall of death. The walls of death come down as well. The story goes that Jesus was captured, he was crucified. He was hung in front of the world to see what happens to people who push against the government and push against Rome and push against the Caesar and push against the other lords that the world desires to worship. And then they took his body and they buried him in a tomb. They put him behind a wall. In Matthew 27, it says this. It says, as evening approached, Joseph, a rich man from Arimathea, who had become a follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate issued an order to release it to him. And Joseph took the body, he wrapped it in this long sheet of clean linen cloth, and he placed it in his own new tomb, which had been carved out of the rock. Then Joseph rolled a great stone across the entrance, and he left the body behind a wall. Now, the interesting thing about Jesus' tomb is that you need to know that Jesus didn't go into that tomb alone. When he goes into that tomb, he takes a few things with him. He takes your fear into the grave. He takes your doubts into the grave. He takes your sin into the grave. He takes your imperfection into the grave with him. And then what the world does is the world rolls a stone in front of it, trying to keep those things permanently sealed there. But we know what Jesus does with walls, don't we? The story goes on that says this in Matthew 28, verse 1 and following. It says, suddenly, anytime the word suddenly comes up in Jesus' story, walls are getting ready to come down. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled aside the stone and sat on it. And his face shone like lightning, and his clothing was as white as snow. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angels spoke to the women, and this is the message that the angels delivered to those women that were at the tomb. Don't be afraid. I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. I know you think he's dead. I know you think he's in the tomb. I know you came here to see a dead body. But he isn't here. He is risen from the dead just as he said would happen. Friends, this is the hope of Easter, that in the midst of all the stuff that you're going through, in the midst of all the walls that you've built up, we begin to realize that they're not as strong and they're not as sturdy as we thought they were. And the hope of Easter is that Jesus comes and he sends us this message. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to struggle with that anymore. I know you came here thinking that death ruled the day, that the walls were strong. Look inside. The walls are empty now. They couldn't hold back Jesus. He's not dead. He's risen. Jesus has won just like he said he would. That's the hope of Easter. Now, here's what we have to do. We have to grab onto that hope. Because even though Jesus brings down walls in this story, there's still walls that we're erecting and building today. So what do we do with those walls? Well, really, we have two options. When it comes to our walls, these things that we've built up in our lives, there's two things we can do. We can learn to live behind them, or we can learn to let Jesus in them. Unfortunately, what many of us do is we learn to live behind them. We look at these walls and we say, they're too big, they're too wide, they're too strong, they're too permanent, they're just part of who I am. So I'm just gonna learn to live with it. I'm gonna make my bed behind it. I'm gonna paint it, I'm gonna decorate it, I'm gonna put pictures up, and I'm just gonna embrace this wall as part of who I am. We've lost hope for it ever leaving. Might as well just embrace it, right? For some of you, you're like, anxiety's just always been there. It's never coming down. This is just who I am. And you've embraced the wall. Can I tell you this? Stop embracing the tomb. For some of you, you look at yourself and you're like, I just have a history. I've got a lot of stuff that's happened to me in my life, a lot of places where I've messed up, or where other people have harmed me and wounded me, or I've got all this shame, and the shame is going nowhere. It's just part of who I am. It's part of my personality. It's just never gonna change. Can I tell you this? Stop embracing the tomb. For some of you, you're like, I'm just wired different. My mind is just different than everybody else's. Faith and belief just doesn't come naturally or easy to me. This is just who I am. These questions will never be answered. The doubt will never go away. Stop embracing the tomb. Stop learning to live behind the walls. A second option is better, to let Jesus in so that he can let you out. Some of you are a belief away from experiencing the freedom that comes when Jesus leaves the tomb. You're a belief in Jesus away from seeing the walls of anxiety come tumbling down. You're a belief in Jesus away from seeing your fears be removed, from seeing your sin be removed. You're a belief in Jesus away from seeing all those doubts that held you back from freedom and joy and love and peace and patience and kindness and happiness from being removed. Those are just barriers that we built up, and those barriers have turned into prisons. They've turned into tombs. Let Jesus into the tomb so you can see what he does with tombs. You know what Jesus does with tombs? He looks at the walls we've built and he says, there is no wall high enough to hold me back. There is no wall wide enough to keep me away from you. There is no wall strong enough to keep me from coming for you. I'll tell you this, Jesus didn't walk out of a tomb so that you can learn to live in a tomb. Jesus came, Jesus died, Jesus rose, and the walls, they're just rubble now.